First Blood.
Justice shall be done. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Foul. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. For my father the king. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Can I help you?
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For Lord Orion. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Foul. Certainly. For Lord Orion. Of course. Feel my wrath. For honor. Certainly. Foul name. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. Certainly. A sound plan. You are past redemption. Feel my wrath. Our brother's town is under attack. For Lord Orion. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
You are past redemption.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town
A
is under
sound
attack.
plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's
A
town is
sound
under
plan.
attack.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our brethren's
For
town
honor.
is under attack.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Oran. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our brethren's town
A
is under
sound
attack.
plan. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice has come. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
You are past redemption. For my father, the king. For Lord Oran.
Betrayer of the light.
Foul name. For my father, the king.
Killing
For
spree.
certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
Yes, me lord.
I'll have it up in
Our
no time.
brethren's town is under attack.
The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is
Certainly.
under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Our
For
brethren's
honor.
town is under attack.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Foul name. Of course. For Lord Oran.
Dominating.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack. is under attack.
You are past redemption. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
For Lord or honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. For my father the king. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Feel my wrath. For my father the king. Feel my wrath. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Justice has come. Foul name. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. For my father the king.
Feel my wrath.
Foul name. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Feel my wrath. Justice has come.
For honor. For my father the king. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Betrayer of the light. You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. Foul name. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Certainly. A sound plan.
Double kill.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light.
Triple kill.
Tower is under attack.
course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. You are past that. For my father, the king.
Unstoppable.
Our brethren's betrayer is under attack. Justice has come. You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
For my father, the king.
Feel my wrath.
Foul knave. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Mega kill.
Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack.
I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Wicked
For
sick.
Lord For honor. Certainly.
Monster kill.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of
Our
course.
brethren's
For
town is
honor.
under attack.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
God spree.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Foul name. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Of course. How may I serve? Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For my father, the king.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
Of course. A sound plan.
Holy shit. Oh, double
A
kill.
sound plan. For honor.
Killing spree.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.